welcome to a special edition of Cross Border Talks, where we are going to have as a guest and speaker a friend of the podcast, Sergiu Miscoiu, a professor of politology, political science, and European studies at the Cluj-Napoca Babeș-Bolyai University in Romania. And the topic is pretty much a topic in his field of knowledge. It's European affairs. On the 9th of May, there was a conference for the future of Europe. And once again, a lot of talk about Europe's redefinition, refoundation, and of course, there were some conclusions that around 50 proposals for changes were made in the report from this conference. Importantly, it is about these changes which are requested by the conference should require redefinition of European agreements. So we would start from here. Mr. Mișcoiu, what is your evaluation of the results of this 1 year of deliberation about Europe's future, which was called Conference for the Future of Europe? And how significant or what could be the result of renegotiations of EU treaties? Isn't it a little bit of a Pandora box?
Hello, good afternoon, and thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to join your cross border talks, a very interesting show online. First of all, we have to stress the fact that this Conference for the Future of Europe was conceived as a tool for strengthening the democratic legitimacy of the European Union. It's not a secret for the people of Europe that one of the most important criticisms about the European Union is the democratic deficit, and we have been discussing about the democratic deficit of the European Union for a very long time. So the Conference for the Future of Europe was meant to be a remedy in front of this democratic deficit, and building on the already classical practices of participatory democracy, of deliberative democracy, to boost the creation of the European public opinion, of a European public space, with citizens expressing, rather on a spontaneous, voluntary basis, their opinions about how Europe should be reorganized, how the European Union should be amended as a project, and what would be the next directions of the European Union. Up to this moment, everything seems to be quite in line with the need for more democracy and for more participation from the citizens. The problem with these deliberative democracy experiments, and we have experienced this throughout the time, and I was among those who have studied a little bit this phenomena, is that those who generally take their opinion and they express them within these debates are those who anyway would participate to the European debates, or to the national debates, or to the processes of deliberation. So, generally, if you do not try to boost those parts of society who are not really able to express themselves, not really willing to express themselves, they believe about themselves as being forgotten, being put aside, then you will end up with the same good old citizens who, anyway, are concerned by the European integration project, are participating in the European elections, are also participating to the national elections, national debates, and are active citizens. And I think that unfortunately, this was what happened with the Conference for the Future of Europe, especially in the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, and in those countries with less pregnant European tradition and democratic tradition. The fact that those parts of society who are already active, those citizens who are already able to contribute to the agenda, express themselves and participated to these debates, and of course brought into the debate some quite interesting issues, and their contribution is not to be at all neglected. This is not really the problem. The problem is that if the objective of these debates was to strengthen the legitimacy by bringing those parts of society to participate to deliberation processes, this did not work. And what we see in the conclusions of these conferences precisely what we expected to see from the very beginning of the debates. And that's why we have an already expected result delivered, which is the proof of the fact that there was little innovation within the processes of deliberation and the discussion for the future of Europe. So the discussion itself was limited in its diversity and limited in its variety, and this was precisely because those parts of society were already involved into debates, already active, were again present and active, strengthening more or less the point of view of the proponents of the Conference for the Future of Europe, meaning that we need more Europe, we need a more social Europe, we need extension, but also we need resilience, we need uh, stronger frontiers of Europe, we need more integration, and so on. All these issues were already known before the deliberation processes, and from this point of view, I think that something, at least in this operation, was missed as a goal.
Yes, so if I understand correctly, European democracy is elites led. It's led by the elites, and in fact, this conference simply strengthened basically the already existing course, if I understand correctly, or priorities of the elites.
Yeah, it was a self confirmation, more or less, of what these leaders of the European Union were thinking about the future of Europe. And this is consistent because the socialization of those people who were participating actively in the debate, with some small exceptions, was very much the mirror of the elite led European Union. Um, we see that, for instance, in countries such as Denmark or Sweden, we had a much more profound debate, especially because it involved people who were not actually meant to be there at the European level, or they were meant to be there on a theoretical level, but still they were not there on based on a practical ground. And this was precisely because these parts of society were never taken into account. They had views about Europe, about the nation state, about the socio-economic orientation of the EU that were quasi incompatible with the long lasting course of the European Union. And we saw that, for instance, in these two countries, Sweden and Denmark, we had more input from the average people who were not socialized in the elite led environment than in the most other countries of the European Union, and especially in the Central and Eastern European countries, where the tradition is quite top down. You involve only people who have already been socialized in some milieus that prepare themselves for having not necessarily 100% the same opinion of the proponents, but very close opinions to what is on the agenda already. And for that, I think a part of society was still outside this. debate.
Okay, how should we refer then to the idea of renegotiations of the EU treaties, which has been something like a taboo for a certain period of time? What should we expect from such a process? Would it be even realistic to renegotiate or change these treaties?
I think that if this was presented as a conclusion of the conference for the future of Europe, there was another point that was quite missed in that, of course, lots of people who support already the European project, especially in the Western countries, believe that the treaties should be renegotiated because it is simply unacceptable to have countries and led by governments who, just for a particular kind of view or opinion, block the major projects of the European Union. But at the same time, if we were to have a quite wider and much more inclusive debate and deliberation, and if those who were somehow excluded from the discussions, rather on a voluntary basis, I don't say that they were excluded per se, but rather self excluding themselves from these processes, were there, then we would have had another kind of line, and in this, according to this line that is hypothetically there somewhere behind the scene, the renegotiation of the treaties should be allowed only if a majority of the people of Europe was in favor of that. So, a plea for a much more direct and participatory democracy at the European level, conditioning changes within the treaties as in a constitutional national framework. A revision of the constitution is conditioned by a vote of the majority of the people. But these elements were really not present there, and we're still in a framework where the governments in charge of the nation states are able to decide about the future of Europe. And this, of course, blocks from the outset any possibility to review the treaties, as we still have, and presumably we will have, governments who are not on the same page as most of the Brussels led elites, France, Germany, and other countries in Western Europe.
Okay, and importantly, on the very same day, there was a speech by Emmanuel Macron, the freshly re elected French president, who came out with an idea which is not exactly so much new, kind of Europe of concentrated circles, if I may say, or Europe of different levels of integration. So he proposed a European political community where countries of the Eastern Partnership can be admitted politically, but not enjoying fully the membership status. And as well, the UK could be also re-engaged in this format. Um, what do you think about such an idea, and what are in fact the concretics behind it? Because as I understand, he was vague in his proposal. He more launched an idea for discussion.
Yeah, it was an interesting starting point from my opinion. It was an interesting starting point, and why is that? Well, precisely because we have a long-lasting experience of one country, Turkey, who was lured throughout time to become a member of the European communities and then of the European Union, kept in the backstage of the show for a very long period, and then accumulating frustration for not being integrated, it dropped the project and went on a very different path, on a national populist path, and now nobody thinks that Turkey is integrable in the European Union. And in order to avoid a similar scenario, as we have now a wave of states from Central and Eastern Europe and from the Caucasus who are willing to join the European Union, who wanted and expressed, ratified their will to join it, but who have territorial differenda with other countries and who are at least partially occupied, and unfortunately for them they are occupied by the same eastern neighbor Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. Then now the problem is what to do with these countries. According to the European treaties as they are, and according to common sense, these countries cannot become directly member of the European Union because this would bring in the midst of the European Union problems of territorial kind, and even worse if we take the case of Ukraine, and thinking that the war will last for some time. So, are we willing to leave these countries the impression that they will join in a touchable future the European Union as it is now? Or are we rather willing to leave them at the mercy of the fate, maybe as a prey for other attempts of Russia or of other countries to destabilize them and to set them on a course that is really in the gray zone, with regimes that are pro Moscow, with regimes that are hostile to the European Union? And the answer is that we should avoid these two alternatives that are, the first not realistic, the second really defeating. And we should rather invent a status that is a special kind of status for countries that are in the close neighborhood of the European Union, who work with the European Union and are for a long time partners of the European Union, and because of different reasons, because of their unwillingness, as in the case of UK, or because of the impossibility in the case of the other countries, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, will not join on a medium term the European Union. By creating this concentric zone, a close concentric zone, then you could really put these countries on a Western like track with lots of benefits and lots of guarantees, including economic investments and the common space of, for instance, free circulation of individuals and even merchandises, without making them proper members of the European Union. And I think that this is the bet in the proposal of Macron, and to some extent, it's something that makes sense given the actual geopolitical configuration.
I understand the point, and I have the feeling you see it more as an encouragement for the neighborhood to be open to Europe. But is it the same status that will be applied to Western Balkan countries? And wouldn't it be a little bit disappointing for them because they might have expected to join in any case and not have a join a membership light, let's say.
Your point is very good, and I think this is why President Macron was ambiguous, as you said, about the issue, because I really believe that President Macron had in the background of his thinking the very idea of integrating these Western Balkan countries within rather the European Union per se, at least at term, then in this wider concentric second circle of the European Union. This doesn't mean that it would be tomorrow, but I think that this was a differentiation between the Western Balkans countries that were quite much more integrable on a medium term in the EU, and the other countries claiming the status of member of the European Union that were rather on a medium and even longer term integrable in the second wider uh, circle of neighbors and friends of the EU.
Okay, let us return to the EU affairs issue and the idea of reform, which, however, is not only related to constitution or simply it involves even now there is change in Europe which is going on, and it has been advanced by the European Commission and various governments in fields such as energy transition. We have had previously anti-corruption, or even now anti-corruption and rule of law is a big issue of contention between Western Europe and some countries of the Central Europe. And also there is the dimension of Europe of defense, with again, these are all kind of subjects which maybe have different are approached in different way from western and eastern part of the EU, and they might be seen as initiatives coming from the western part of the EU and little bit treating the eastern part as a little bit like a territory, not and so I want basically I want to ask you if you look at the big picture with these efforts of modernization and transition, etc. What is coming out of that
Yeah.
with regard to our region, because we are in Central and Southeastern Europe?
It's a very, very interesting question. It's also a very complex issue. Why is that? Well, because on a first glance, things could be very well presented as such, meaning that Western Europeans, who are the founding members of the EU, who have to some extent some sort of a tutorship on the European project, advance in a condescending way topics on the agenda that are specific to their countries, that are specific to the concerns of the Western Europeans, and which are in the end to be implemented by the Southern Eastern Europeans who are at most second degree citizens of the EU. And this is a story that could, of course, hold together in the public discourse. But there is the other story that could explain these initiatives, in that we can also depict the situation as follows: the Western European countries have a longer lasting democratic experience, and they pass through different phases of democratization, of development, of reform. And if they are now trying to impose to the whole continent a series of reforms that belong to a third or a fourth age of human rights, of democratization, of issues on the public agenda, is because they would like that the Eastern European countries um, jump over the stages, but by not repeating the mistakes that were done by Western Europe. For instance, in terms of heavy industrialization, in terms of the first or second ages of digitalization. Eastern Europe has now the unique historical chance to jump over the stages and to get the latest technologies. In the same way, Eastern Europe has now the chance of having a quasi dysfunctional or even completely dismantled industrial package, and with this absence of heavy industry in Central and Eastern Europe that was dismantled after 1989, we do not have to repeat the era of Western Europe to go back to good old reindustrialization, as some of them did. It is much more desirable to jump over the stages and to go directly into a environmental friendly age where we implement directly the last generation of technologies, and we create jobs, and we build cities that are eco-friendly, and they cope also with lots of the requirements concerning climate change. Why is that? Because anyway the citizens of Central and Eastern Europe, in a couple of years, will arrive to the point where they will demand ecological cities. So the idea is that we should go faster over some stages that already showed the limits in Western Europe. And if we are to implement these requirements, and if our reforms of the treaties will go in this direction, this will mean that we will benefit of the experience of Western Europe without going through the traumatic history of it.
Okay, uh, that's great, of course, but let me remind that the introduction of market for the prices of energy, for example, electricity, in Romania and Bulgaria led to um, some kind of shock, or even trauma for a number of users. In the case of Romania, not only firms but also households. In the case of Romania, of Bulgaria, so far only companies and public entities.
It will come
So
soon also in Bulgaria, also for the households.
Uh, but the price for households is still regulated in our case. So here, let me say that we it looks like a little bit like a shock
Yeah.
therapy, and what should be the answer of, and which authorities should answer to this sh- shock, let's
In
say.
my opinion, this is
Uh,
precisely the error that the Central and Eastern European countries should not do. So now in Western Europe, the discussions are how to get rid of the free market in terms of energy. And I mean it, even some liberal politicians, such as the Prime Minister of the Netherlands or the freshly elected, re elected President Macron, uh, take very seriously the issue of having freed partially or totally the market of energy, as being an error that was made by Western Europe, and like it was the case before with savage capitalism in the 19th century. I think that this is one historical occasion not to repeat the fault of what was done in the West. So I think that the next European Union, as it is now projected, is much more ecological friendly and much less market oriented in terms of energy, in terms of freedom for the huge corporations, and volatility of the labor markets, as it was the case with the prior European Union. And if we interpret like this the reform of the treaties, and we've put these ideas on the agenda, then it shows that we did not repeat the errors of the Western European Union.
So, what can we do to encourage such a social Europe? You might be aware that in Romania, and in other countries in our region, EU seems to be often associated with business, with corporations, and less with common people or workers. Uh,
Yeah, that's a
there is a general.
difference of the image of the two, and I really believe that in all the influencers in Central and Eastern Europe evolved from one generation to another. We are already almost at the second generation of influencers in terms of what the European Union is. And the newest generation of influencers, academics, journalists, think tankers, or other, is much more aware of this need for a social Europe, and also of this identity of Europe as being first social space, then market oriented space. And I think we did not do enough for prompting this image of Europe, and not prompting the projects embracing the social court of the European Union. And of course, you're very right, and this reminds me of a Western professor who came 10 years ago in Romania and Bulgaria, by the way, and witnessed the realities in these countries. And her conclusion was that the labor unions in Romania and Bulgaria are much more neoliberal than the owners' unions in Western Europe. So this is something that changed, I think, in during the last 10 years. The image of Europe as being a market is less pregnant than it was before, and I think that we are responsible. And when I say we, I really mean you and I, or the others who are aware and interested about these issues, to prompt this change through our representation, and especially through our demands that we express publicly in broadcasts like this one.
Okay, I thank you for bringing up the issue that we are a Bulgarian and Romanian discussing about Europe, and we are a specific zone of Europe, let's say, because we are not admitted to the Schengen area, and well, there have been discussions about the options of euro, but that is still not happening in spite of all the discussions. And economically or socially, we usually stand in the last places of the rankings in terms of social cohesion and other indicators, social indicators. So I was wondering, let us conclude with that, if Europe is going undergoing reform, what will be the either the role which our two countries could proactively ask for and fight for, or what will be the role prescribed for our two countries, given that we are also in the vicinity of the Black Sea and the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, I will do now. I think my André Malraux saying that not the 21st century will be religious or will not be at all, but I would say that the next European Union will either be social and ecological, or will not be at all. And the countries in the Balkans have at the same time a huge disadvantage and a huge advantage in that. The huge disadvantage is that these countries are still seeking, as you said, for basic advancements in terms of social equity, in terms of way of living, in terms of normality in the institutional framework, in terms of honesty, morality in the public space, and so on. At the same time, there is the advantage of these countries, which is prompted by their geopolitical location. Now, they are really the last ramparts, the most advanced advanposts of the European Union within a very gray area, which seems to become unstable. And these two countries are oases of stability and of Europeness in the area. And this would normally prompt these countries to become much more active in defending not their egoistic views of the world, but the very altruistic views of their citizens, who would basically try to become wealthier, to have a much more stable future, and who would also like to live in an institutional framework that is to a higher extent predictable, and in this way they can raise their children in Bulgaria and Romania and project the future of their lives and their countries. So because of this unique geopolitical advantage that is under the current situation much more an advantage than it was before. I think that if the elites in these two countries would be a little bit more responsible and able to cope with the tasks of the historical momentum that they share, they would be much more able to defend the interests of their citizens, who once again are not national egoistic but are very much compatible with the interests of the average citizens of the European Union itself.
I never expected that a talk about European Union or even Bulgaria and Romania could be so affirming, life affirming, let's say. I've been accustomed to depressive discussions about the countries and even Europe. So thank you very much for this talk, Sergiu Mișcoiu. And I hope our listeners and readers will follow us on our multi media channels in YouTube, Telegram, Twitter, and so on.